Okay, thank you. My name is Edie Loyer Nelson. I've been a resident of Shoreline for 52 years. I'm a member of the Duwamish Tribe, and I'm here today with people that know about the language that our first people in this area used, and I'd like to introduce them at this time. David Buerge has been a teacher, historian, and writer, and he's an alum of the University of Washington and the Peace Corps. He's been researching the history of the greater Seattle area since the mid-1970s. He's published 14 books of history and biography. Ken Workman is also a member of the Duwamish Tribe, and he's one of the few fluent Lushootseed speakers available today, and he'll be sharing some of his talents with us. Ken is one of the base people of the Duwamish Tribe, has been helping them for years. Welcome, David and Ken.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Edie.
Well, here we are in Shoreline, and we have 4 place names that relate specifically, well, 2 actually that relate specifically to Shoreline. Other ones are on the Lake Washington shore, but that means that there were campsites here, and whenever a place is named, it seems as though that's a fairly significant place, and so when it's on a beach, that's where people come to either collect clams or to set up a camp so they can go further inland to a place, for example, Ronald Bog or Oak Lake. So there's this historical context that these names illuminate. And as an outsider, it's interesting to realize the depth of information that these words signify, but also that this land was used so intensely by the native people.
Mm-hmm. Well, in our language, this Lushootseed language, it's a very compressed language. Mm-hmm. It's more akin, and this is just me talking, it's more akin to the sounds that nature makes. Mm-hmm. So when animals talk to each other, they're very compressed. They use their body gestures, they use their eyes when they move, like in crows, and they compress a lot of information into these simple sounds. And we're kind of the same way. And so we were just talking about this location, Ka'ada. Mm-hmm. And so as Lushootseed speakers, we just go, oh yeah, well, what's that? Well, that's a place over there where lots of things happen. Mm-hmm. And so really when you break Ka'ada down, it's Ka, which means QA, which means many, and Ad is the root for me and mine, and Ub is things are happening. And it just sort of rolls out as Ka'ada. Mm-hmm. And so yes, Lushootseed is a very compressed language, and you begin to speak like nature.
Yeah, they say crows spoke Lushootseed. And when you listen to crows, the way some of them, it's not just caw, 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 they have a whole sub-dialect, it seems. And then the sounds they make that are in the back, they sound in the back of the throat, that sounds an awful lot like when people speak Lushootseed, and they produce these exotic sounds. It's very difficult for English people. It's difficult for me to pronounce them, which is why when I write these things, I use the closest English equivalent I can find, because most English speakers will not be able to reproduce those sounds without practice. But it's the most exotic, extraordinary language. And it's so unique. And it's so unique to hear it today. To hear Lushootseed spoken today, to me, is nothing short of a miracle.
Well, it is an interesting language.
I'm going to give you the names of some places here in Shoreline. If you could give us the Lushootseed interpretation for those names and something about it, I would appreciate it.
Well, I'll do my best, Edie.
Okay, the first one we're going to start with, Kayu Kayu Ach.
Kayu Kayu Ach. Kinnikinnick. This is the English name, Kinnikinnick. Kayu means corpse, and Ats means it's like the whole thing, like Hakpayats. Hakpai is cedar, like a cedar branch, and Otz means it's the whole tree. So in Kayo Otz, there's a lot of kinnikinnick around, and so that Otz means it's the whole bush. And so wherever this stuff was growing, people had an association with, well, corpses. So that's what Kayo Otz
Do you
means.
know if there was did it play a role in funeral rituals at all?
I don't know.
Yeah. I was thinking, it's like, it was supposed to be a mild narcotic. Unlike, tobacco is a mild narcotic, but tobacco grew in eastern Washington. I don't know if it grew native here, but it did grow in eastern Washington. But nicotine was an additive they would put into tobacco to smoke it. And then I understand that they would have hallucinatory experiences, which, like dreaming, is voyaging to another world. And another world is the world of the dead. And shaman, are shaman because they can go between the world of the living and the world of the dead. They can communicate with the spirits. And so I'm wondering if the concept of death, when we think of death now, we think of dead people, but it seems to me death also describes another world, another existence, another form of consciousness or unconsciousness. But I wonder if it had that connotation too. Do you think?
Yes, I would think as a narcotic it would.
Yeah.
And our relationship with people that have passed with death is different than what you would call traditional. People
Yes.
pass away, they're gone. We don't look at it that way.
That's right.
Duwamish.
That's right.
They pass away and they go into this other place to be reborn back into their ancestors.
And they're always present.
So unlike
Yeah.
reincarnation,
Yeah,
where you
yeah.
can come back as an animal or something
Yeah.
else, for us, you can only come back in a descendant.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have this concept of reincarnation and this otherworldly thing. And so sure, kinnikinnick is one of those hallucinogenics that can be used. There's stories about that stuff.
Yeah.
Well, the next shoreline place we would like to hear you say in Lushootseed is Lake Ballinger.
Ballinger, oh yeah. Atsu. It's Atsu. And there's a gloss up in there, so it's an S, which nominalizes this name. And Ats. And then there's a U on the end. So it's the center of something. And there's a question mark on the end. So it's Ats, just like I was describing Hakpai Ats and Kayo Ats, Kayo Ats. So now we have Ats on the end, which means it's something that's part of a whole. And so what is that? So this thing is centered, whatever it is, and this Lake Ballinger apparently is centered between something.
Well,
And
I
I
don't, like you say, the sus on the S sound is basically says here comes a noun, and the noun is the proper noun, the name, Atsu. And Waterman, who was T.T. Waterman, who was the ethnolinguist who was here about 1918 to 1920. He taught at the University of Washington. He taught summer school, and he was an anthropologist. He worked with Kroger in Northern California, and he's actually one of the people who worked with Ishi, the Yaqui man in Northern California. But anyway, he said it, his informants told him it meant face, that the lake meant face. And there's an island right in the middle of the lake, a little island. And I was always wondering, the lake is sort of oblong, and there's a rise, an elevation rise south of the lake, and you look on the lake, it looks like a face. I don't know, there's all sorts of possibilities. It could have mythic connotations. So many of these places are associated with myths that go back, who knows how long. And the lake gave its name to the creek. And so on the Lake Washington side, you have Lushootseed, the mouth of Satsu. And so that was the mouth of the creek that drained Satsu. So presumably, now Thornton Creek is Tsu, and then you have Satsu north of it. And so there might be a relationship between those two, because they're parallel streams. Another thing about Ballinger that's very important, I think, is that it's a crossroads between trails. So you had a trail coming from Edmonds going down to Lake Washington. And then you had this long north-south trail that went from, at least from Lake Union, probably up to Silver Lake. And Lake Ballinger was a place where they met. And it's a big lake. There were salmon that came up McClear Creek to the lake to spawn. There were also resident fish in the lake. It was a big shoreline, so there were lots of wetlands, especially in the north. So there were muskrats, and there were all sorts of things. But anyway, it was basically a very prolific campground, very fertile place. And so my guess is that people would go there and spend time there to gather resources, but also just to socialize. It's like interesting when you think about what it must have been like. As I mentioned, logistically, to get all the camp material, to get the material was a big deal. And then you were working constantly, preparing, drying things, preserving things. And the whole family was involved, women, men, children. And that must have been a marvelous experience, especially for the kids. I would think, going out, getting out of your crowded longhouse in the wintertime, going up, and then, so Lushootseed was a very memorable place.
Interesting. Okay, next place in Shoreline is Bitter Lake.
Bitter Lake, Chalkwadi. This is an interesting name. Quadi, if you look up the definition, it says something about death and something about hold. So quad means to hold. I am holding something. Chaw is the interesting part. That's because C wedge AL is the northern version of how. But down here in the southern version of Lushootseed, you take away the C wedge, the very first character, and you replace it with an X wedge, and it's pronounced hell. There's a hard H in there.
Yes.
And so we immediately know a difference between somebody that's coming from the north when they say, how are you? That's hell chafo, versus es chaw chafo. So there's the difference right there. And now we're talking about Bitter Lake, and it's got this northern connotation to it. So I have to kind of wonder who was down here and who said what for somebody, English writing person, to record it like this, Chalkwadi.
And it might not have been the name of the lake as much as a name of something collected at the lake or found at the lake. And most of these, the reason why these places were named was because they were important places to go to collect material that you could bring back to the longhouse preserved, that would get you through the winter months when you couldn't go out from November to late February. We really couldn't go out because the weather was so terrible. And so you had to have something to preserve to feed yourself during that period of time. So that's what that 9 months of summer traveling and gathering was all about, was to preserve enough food to last you through the winter. And there were resources in the wintertime, but that was a constant effort to maintain life, not just survival, but to flourish. And so the labor involved in producing enough to survive and flourish was considerable. And these place names essentially are evidence of that. Yeah.
Okay, the next place in Shoreline is Sheraton Beach, Boulder.
Oh, it's chakla. Chaka means rock.
Yeah.
And so there's a rock there, something's associated, and BS is permanent. So you can take what you want from that, but apparently there's a rock at Sheraton Beach, and it's permanent. And so this conforms to the way we call things. Where do you live? I live on the bend of the river. Where do you live? Over by the big rock. Things like this. So this Bachakla would be a permanent rock.
And it's about the size of the room that we're in. It's the biggest rock, glacially erratic, in the city of Seattle. It's as big as a house. Now, originally the lake was about 9 feet higher, so only the surface of the rock would have been exposed. And it would have been exposed a little offshore. But nevertheless, it was visible, and so it was a landmark. And there were probably trails that led from that area to other places. Wedgwood Boulder, which is further south, was another one of those places. It was a big glacially erratic, again, the size of a house, and trails connected there. And so, like, you would say, well, I will meet you at this rock or this particular rock. And people would know exactly what you were talking about. It would be like giving a street intersection here today, because then you could locate it in your mind. And the place name allowed people then to do the same thing. So it was an important thing because of the function that it performed in the society.
But also notice that the name is Bus,
Yeah.
meaning permanent. It didn't say Hague or it didn't say Hague. It said Bus. So Hague is big, Bus Chakla is permanent. Hague Chakla is big rock. So the name of this thing apparently must have been around for a long time, because it's
Yeah.
being used as a marker for intergenerational something.
And as I say, the full extent of the rock would not have been apparent as it is today, because the lake level has been dropped and its immensity is revealed. But still, it was big enough then, like you say, to be, it was probably there for thousands of years. And trails led away from it. That was, you would go on the lake shore and you would see the rock and you would know that if you landed there, there was a trail that led to a specific group of places. And so it was as important as an intersection or a freeway, entrance. Something people knew about.
So all of these places have names, and they're the kind of names that we would give them as native people to describe a thing. Something, this is where I gather clams,
Yeah.
or this is where I do a lot of work, or this rock is always there. And so all of these places, that's us, Edie. That's, Duwamish people have been hanging out been present on the land for a long time.
Thank you both for your expertise today.
You're
This
welcome.
has been very valuable. And if people want to learn a little bit more about the places in Shoreline and the Lushootseed language, you can go to the Shoreline Historical Museum at the corner of 185th and Linden, or you could get the book that David Buerge wrote called The City of Seattle, Chief Seattle and the City That Took His Name. And that's available at the museum or in bookstores. Thank you for your attention today.